I never thought the worst morning of my life would also be the one that changed everything. I was 20 minutes late, my coffee was cold, and my landlord had just texted me about 3 months of overdue rent. I walked into the office already feeling like a man quietly drowning, when my assistant manager stopped me at the door with a look I had never seen on her face before. "Mr. Callum, Miss Hargrove wants you now." Her private office. My stomach dropped. Elena Hargrove, CEO, the kind of woman who made boardrooms go silent just by entering them. In 2 years of working beneath her, she had never once said my name directly. Not once. I straightened my tie, knocked twice, and stepped inside. She didn't look up from the documents on her desk immediately. She let me stand there, fully, deliberately, for a long 10 seconds before those sharp gray eyes finally lifted to meet mine. "Sit down, Callum." I sat. She slid a folder across the desk. Clean, crisp, formal. "I need a husband," she said, the same way someone orders coffee. "For exactly 1 year. The compensation is $100,000. I'd like your answer by Friday." I stared at her for what felt like an entire geological era. "I'm sorry," I said slowly. "Could you repeat that?" "Because I'm fairly certain I just heard you propose to me using the same tone you use for quarterly reports." The corner of her mouth didn't even twitch. "You heard me correctly," she said, folding her hands on the desk with the precision of a surgeon. "Hargrove Industries is finalizing a merger with Castellan Group. Montgomery Castellan, the patriarch, is deeply traditional. He will not sign a $50 million deal with an unmarried woman running the company alone. He considers it." She paused, as though the next word physically offended her. "Unstable. And out of everyone in this building," I said carefully, "you chose me. You're observant, presentable, and you don't talk excessively," she replied. "In this office, that combination is rarer than you'd think." I almost laughed. Almost. I took the folder home that night and read every page twice. It was the most thorough, most coldly constructed document I had ever held in my hands. There were clauses for public appearances, clauses for social media conduct, clauses for physical boundaries, written so precisely that even a handshake required contextual justification. She had thought of everything except, apparently, how bizarre it was to contract a human being for emotional performance. I needed the money. That part was embarrassingly simple. My father's medical bills had been quietly swallowing me whole for 14 months, and my savings account looked like it had given up on life entirely. So on Friday morning, I walked back into her office, sat down without being asked this time, and slid the signed folder back across her desk. She glanced at my signature, said nothing, just gave a single, efficient nod. "You'll move into the guest suite of my residence this weekend," she said. "I'll have the details sent to you." "Lovely," I said. "Should I bring a housewarming gift, or is there a clause against that too?" She looked up then, just briefly. Something passed behind those gray eyes, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. "Don't push it, Callum." Moving in was its own kind of theater. Her home was exactly what I expected. Architectural, immaculate, and almost aggressively quiet. Everything in its place. No clutter, no personality scattered across the countertops. No evidence that a human being with feelings actually lived there. It felt less like a home and more like a very expensive idea of one. She gave me a tour with the warmth of a museum guide. Kitchen, library, your suite, my suite, which you will never enter without explicit invitation. "Understood," I said. "And the living room? Is that neutral territory, or do I need to submit a formal request?" She stopped walking, turned to look at me with an expression that was somewhere between irritation and reluctant recalibration. "Do you find yourself amusing?" she asked. "Frequently," I said. "You'll get used to it." She didn't respond, but she also didn't fire me on the spot, which I chose to interpret as progress. The first real test came 3 days later. Her assistant called us both into a prep session for an upcoming Castellan family dinner. Apparently, Montgomery Castellan wanted to meet us informally before any paperwork was discussed. We needed to look the part. We needed to feel the part. Her assistant, a nervous young woman named Priya, sat across from us with a clipboard and the expression of someone defusing a bomb. So, Priya began gently, "We should probably discuss how you two interact as a couple." Alina and I looked at each other. The silence lasted exactly long enough to be uncomfortable. "We're working on it," I said. Alina straightened her jacket and said nothing. But this time, and I noticed it clearly, she didn't quite meet my eyes. And for a woman who held eye contact like a weapon, that small, quiet evasion told me everything. The Castellan dinner was held at a private estate 40 minutes outside the city, Old Money. The kind of place where the hedges were trimmed into perfect geometry, and the silence had a texture to it. I adjusted my tie in the car on the way there, and Elena reached over without a word and straightened it with 2 fingers. Quick, precise, unbothered, as though she had done it 1,000 times before. I looked at her. She looked out the window. "Thank you," I said. "You had a crooked tie," she replied. "It would have reflected poorly on me." "Right," I said. "For a moment I thought you almost cared. Don't flatter yourself." Callum. But the ghost of something that wasn't quite professional detachment, lingered in the small space between us the entire rest of the drive. Montgomery Castellan was exactly what I had imagined. 70s, silver-haired, with the handshake of a man who believed character was measured in firmness of grip. He looked at Elena with the particular brand of skepticism that powerful women have been quietly enduring for centuries. Then he looked at me, and something in his assessment shifted, as though my presence beside her recalibrated his entire reading of the room. "So," he said, settling into his chair at the head of the long dining table, "how did you two meet?" Elena opened her mouth. I spoke first. "She interviewed me," I said, reaching over and resting my hand lightly over hers on the table. And somewhere between her third impossible question and the moment she told me I was adequately promising, I decided I wasn't leaving without her number. Montgomery laughed, a real one, surprised out of him. Elena turned to look at me with an expression so perfectly calibrated between warmth and barely contained homicide that I genuinely couldn't tell which direction she was leaning. "He's being generous," she said smoothly, turning back to Montgomery. "What he means is that he was persistent to the point of being a minor inconvenience." "The best love stories always start that way," Montgomery's wife said warmly from across the table. Under the table, Elena's hand turned, almost imperceptibly, and her fingers rested against mine. Not pulling away. Just staying. I kept my expression perfectly neutral. Internally, I had absolutely no idea what to do with that information. The drive home was quieter than the drive there. She had her elbow resting against the window, watching the city lights blur past. The composed, architectural version of Elena Hargrove that existed in boardrooms and dinner parties had softened, just slightly, around the edges. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "You did well tonight," she said finally, without turning from the window. "High praise," I said. "I'll have it framed. Don't, too late." I'm already mentally choosing the font. The quietest sound escaped her then. It wasn't quite a laugh. It was something smaller and more unguarded than that, the kind of sound a person makes when amusement catches them off guard before they can stop it. I stored it away like something rare. Then we walked back into the house, and she stopped in the hallway. And I watched the warmth drain from her face in real time, replaced by something complicated and unreadable. Because standing in the living room, with a travel bag at his feet and an easy, familiar smile on his face, was a man I had never seen before. But Elena clearly had. Her entire body went still in a way I had never witnessed. Not composed stillness, but the specific paralysis of someone confronting something they believed was safely buried in the past. "Daniel," she said. His name in her mouth sounded like a warning. He smiled wider. "Hello, Elena. And you must be the husband." His eyes moved to me with an interest that felt less like curiosity and more like calculation. I've been hearing such interesting things. If you felt that tension, drop a comment below and tell me. Do you trust Daniel? Because I wasn't sure I did. And neither, I think, was she. Don't forget to hit like if you're already invested in where this is going. Daniel Mercer, as it turned out, was her ex-fiancé. Priya told me the next morning in a hushed corridor whisper, with the energy of someone who had been holding that particular piece of information under pressure for a very long time. Apparently, he and Elena had been engaged 3 years ago. Apparently, it had ended badly. Apparently, badly was doing a significant amount of heavy lifting in that sentence, because the way Elena had looked at him in that hallway, that frozen, almost breakable stillness, told me the story went considerably deeper than a clean separation. He was staying in the city for 2 weeks. Business, he claimed. And because Elena's world was the particular size that it was, their social circles overlapped enough that avoiding him entirely wasn't an option. Which meant I needed to be more convincing than ever. She came into the kitchen the following morning, earlier than usual, no blazer. Just a white shirt, her hair down, a coffee cup held in both hands like it was the only steady thing in the room. She looked, for the first time since I had known her, like someone who hadn't slept. I was already at the counter making eggs. She stopped in the doorway. "You cook," she said. Less an observation, more a small recalibration of whatever model she had built of me in her head. "Occasionally," I said, "when I'm not busy being a minor inconvenience." She sat down at the kitchen island without being asked, which, in the unspoken geography of this house, felt quietly significant. I slid a plate across to her. She looked at it for a moment, then at me. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," I said simply. "Eat, Elena." Something moved across her face. Not quite vulnerability. Something just before it, the expression of a person standing at the edge of allowing themselves to be taken care of, and not being entirely sure the ground is solid. She ate. We talked that morning in a way we hadn't before. Not about the contract, not about Castellan, not about Daniel. She told me about growing up as the only daughter of a man who built an empire and assumed she would simply inherit his ambition without also inheriting his loneliness. She said it plainly, without self-pity, staring into her coffee cup, and that plainness made it hit harder than any dramatic confession would have. "You talk about loneliness like it's a business metric," I said quietly. "Like it's something to be managed rather than felt." She was quiet for a long moment. "That's because feeling it doesn't change it," she finally said. "No," I agreed, "but pretending it isn't there doesn't either." She looked at me then, fully, without the armor, and for a single unguarded moment, Elena Hargrove looked exactly like what she was underneath all of it. A person who was exhausted from holding everything together alone. I didn't look away, neither did she. That afternoon we attended a charity luncheon where Daniel was also present, smiling, charming, watching Elena with the patient attention of someone waiting for a performance to slip. So I made sure it didn't. I kept my hand at the small of her back. I laughed at the right moments. When she spoke, I watched her the way a man watches someone he finds endlessly interesting, because somewhere between that kitchen conversation and that moment, it had stopped being entirely an act. At one point she leaned close to say something quietly in my ear, and I turned so that our faces were closer than necessary, and I murmured back, "He's watching us." "I know," she whispered. "Good," I said. "Then don't pull away." She didn't. But that night, while she was in a call with her legal team, I walked past the library and noticed her desk. A folder, open, with a document on top that I recognized, because it had my name on it, and a date. A date that was 4 months earlier than the date she had told me. The merger required the contract to end. I stood in that doorway, the same way she had stood in the hallway the night Daniel arrived, completely still, trying to understand what exactly I was looking at, and what it meant that she hadn't told me. I didn't say anything that night. I closed the library door quietly, walked back to my suite, and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a long time, turning the information over in my mind the way you turn a stone, looking for the angle that makes it make sense. Maybe it was a different document. Maybe I had misread the date. Maybe there was a perfectly logical explanation that didn't lead to the conclusion my chest was already quietly arriving at. But I knew what I had seen. The merger clause, the specific contractual deadline Elena had presented to me as absolute and non-negotiable, had been satisfied 4 months ago. The Castellan signatures were already on record. The deal was done. The reason for the contract, the entire architecture of justification she had built, had quietly ceased to exist, while I was still living in her house, sharing her kitchen, learning the specific sound of her rare, unguarded laugh. I had been kept, and I hadn't even known to ask why. The following days were the strangest of the entire arrangement, because nothing on the surface changed. We still had our morning coffee. She still corrected my tie with 2 fingers, and pretended it was purely aesthetic. We still traded sharp, quiet remarks across dinner that walked the precise line between wit and warmth. And I, God help me, still looked forward to every single moment of it. That was the part that made it complicated. If I had felt nothing, the discovery would have been clean. A betrayal, a confrontation, an exit. Simple. But I felt something that had been growing so quietly and so steadily that I hadn't noticed its full size until I was standing in the middle of it, and the ground beneath it was uncertain. "You're quiet today," she said one morning, watching me over the rim of her cup. "I'm often quiet," I said. "Not this kind of quiet," she replied, because Elena Hargrove, for all her emotional armor, was extraordinarily good at reading rooms. It was what made her exceptional at her job, and apparently it extended to reading me. I looked at her across the kitchen island. "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask," she said carefully. "I reserve the right to not answer." "When does this end?" I said. Not the version of the question about the contract, the real version, the one underneath it. She set her cup down, very slowly, very precisely. "The contract specifies." "I know what the contract specifies," I said quietly. The air between us changed. Something tightened in her expression, not defensiveness exactly, but the specific tension of a person who realizes a conversation they have been quietly dreading has finally arrived at the door. "Callum," she began. "I'm not asking about paperwork, Elena." She was silent for a long moment. The kitchen felt very still. "Then I don't know how to answer that," she finally said, and the way she said it, not deflecting, not corporate, but genuinely, quietly uncertain, told me more than a direct answer would have. That weekend, Priya called me privately. She had been sorting through some archived correspondence for Elena, and had found something she thought I might want to know about. Her voice on the phone had the careful, apologetic quality of someone delivering information they wish they didn't have. The inheritance condition. The business merger clause. The entire contractual premise. It had never been strictly required by Castellan at all. Montgomery Castellan's team had raised a preference, a soft suggestion about stability. And Elena had taken that single, minor preference and constructed an entire binding contract around it. She had built the architecture herself. She had chosen me. Deliberately. Specifically. And then hidden the choosing behind language and clauses, and the professional distance of a folder slid across a desk. I sat with that for a long time. Then I picked up my keys. I need to stop here for a second, because if you've made it this far, you already know this story is something different. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't yet, and tell me in the comments. What do you think Elena was actually afraid of? Because I think I finally understood it, and it broke my heart a little. I drove for a long time without a destination. The kind of driving that isn't really about getting anywhere. It's about giving your mind enough motion to think clearly. The city moved past the windows in streaks of light and shadow, and I kept returning to the same image. Elena at that kitchen island, her coffee held in both hands, saying, "I don't know how to answer that," with the quiet devastation of someone who knew exactly what the answer was and couldn't make herself say it out loud. She had built a contract because she didn't know how to build a conversation. She had paid for proximity because she didn't know how to ask for it. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, I had stopped being an employee completing a transaction and had become something neither of us had budgeted for. I came back to the house late that evening. She was in the living room when I walked in, standing at the window with her arms crossed, still dressed from whatever she'd been doing that day, the city lights behind her, casting everything in that particular shade of blue that makes ordinary moments look like paintings. She turned when she heard the door. She had been waiting. That detail sat in my chest like a stone. "We should talk," I said. "Yes," she agreed. No deflection, no corporate rerouting. Just yes. I sat down on the couch. She remained standing for a moment, and I watched her make the conscious decision to sit, which for Elena felt like its own kind of surrender. She chose the chair across from me rather than beside me. Distance as instinct. "I know about the merger," I said. "I know the Castellan deal was finalized months ago. I know the clause was never a hard requirement." She didn't flinch, didn't deny it. She looked at me with those gray eyes and absorbed the words with the stillness of someone who had been quietly rehearsing for this moment and still wasn't ready for it. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Long enough," I said. "Why didn't you tell me?" The silence that followed was the longest we had ever shared. Not the comfortable kind that had developed between us over months of mornings and quiet evenings. This was the weighted kind, the kind that has texture and consequence. "Because," she started, then stopped, pressed her lips together, tried again. "Because if I told you the reason was gone, you would have left. And she stopped again. "And you what, Elena?" Her hands, resting on her knees, tightened slightly, just slightly. The only visible evidence of what it was costing her to sit in this room and be this honest. "I wasn't ready for the house to be quiet again," she said finally. So quietly I almost missed it. I looked at her for a long moment. "That's not a business answer," I said. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." I stood up then, walked to the window where she had been standing when I came in. The city below looked the same as it always did. Indifferent, continuous, enormous. The kind of view that makes personal crises feel simultaneously urgent and meaningless. "I spent 14 months drowning quietly before you called me into that office," I said, my back still to her. "I signed that contract because I needed the money." That part was true. I turned then. But somewhere along the way, Elena, I stopped counting the months. And I think you know when that happened. She was watching me with an expression I had never seen on her before. Not the composed CEO. Not the careful, armored woman who slid folders across desks and issued instructions to rooms full of people. Just her. Unguarded and still and terrified in the specific way that only hope can make a person terrified. "The contract expires Friday," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I know," I said. And I picked up my jacket and walked to my suite. And I didn't sleep at all. Friday arrived the way significant days always do. Quietly, without ceremony, as though the calendar had no idea what it was asking of people. I had packed most of my things the night before. Not because I had made a decision, but because I needed to understand what making that decision actually felt like. Whether putting my books into a box and folding my clothes made the choice feel like freedom or loss. It felt like loss. That told me everything I needed to know. I found her in the library at 7 in the morning. She was at her desk, but she wasn't working. She was sitting very still, her hands flat on the surface in front of her, looking at nothing in particular. The composed, architectural Elena Hargrove that the world knew, the one who made boardrooms go silent, was nowhere in that room. Just her, quiet, waiting for something she didn't know how to ask for. I set my keys on the edge of her desk. She looked at them, then at me. "I've been sitting here," she said, "trying to write you a final payment summary." A pause. "I've rewritten the opening line 11 times. "What does it say?" I asked. "Nothing that means what I actually want to say." I pulled the chair across from her desk and sat down. The same way I had sat down 11 months ago, when she slid a folder across this very surface and changed both our lives with the detached efficiency of a woman who had learned to conduct everything, including longing, like a business transaction. "Then say what you actually want to say," I told her. She looked at me for a long moment, and then Elena Hargrove, who had never once in my presence allowed herself to be anything less than precisely in control, took a slow breath and let the armor go. "I built the contract," she said, "because I had spent 3 years after Daniel making sure I would never need anyone again. And then you walked into my office and you were." She paused, choosing carefully. "You were so entirely unbothered by me. Everyone else in that building was afraid of me. And you just weren't. You're very easy not to be afraid of," I said quietly. "When you can see past the performance." Something broke open in her expression, not dramatically, just a quiet, irreversible softening, like the first moment a winter morning decides to become spring. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "The version of this that doesn't have terms and clauses and an exit provision. I don't know how to just, Elena." She stopped. "You taught me how to act like a man who was in love with you," I said. "Do you remember that? The prep session. You sat across from me and told me to watch you like I found you endlessly interesting." I held her gaze. I never had to learn that part. The silence that followed was the softest one we had ever shared. She stood up slowly, walked around the desk, stopped in front of me with the careful, deliberate movement of a woman choosing something for the first time in a very long time. Not because it was strategic, not because it was written into an agreement, but because it was true. "Stay," she said, simply, just that word, undecorated and uncontracted. Not for a salary, not for a year, just stay. I reached up and took her hand, the same hand that had straightened my tie in the car, that had rested against mine under a dinner table, that had held a coffee cup like it was the only steady thing in the room. I never actually finished packing, I told her. And for the first time, fully, completely, without reservation, Elena Hargrove laughed. We didn't sign anything that day, no folders, no clauses, no exit provisions. Just two people standing in a library at 7 in the morning, choosing each other in the only language that has never required a contract, the language of simply staying. If this story moved you, if you've ever hidden behind structure because vulnerability felt too risky, share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe for more stories like this one, and drop a comment below. What was the moment you knew? For me, it was always the laugh. It was always the laugh.